All right, let's be turning our Bibles to chapter 7 of Genesis. Chapter 7. We are continuing our study in the life of Noah, and we are going to address new questions off of that next sheet of study for our, we have a section, it's like 3 different sections on this part, chapter 7 and chapter 8 of Noah's life, which we're mostly dealing with the flood right now. So if you need a copy of that, we've got extra copies on the back table. I think there's like four or so questions on it, 4 or 5. We'll be working on about the first 2 of those today. But this is lesson number 7, Noah Saved His Family, part 2 is where we are at. All right, so while you're turning, let me do a quick update on what we did last evening. There are a lot of people in this room who were part of it last night. We always try the very last Saturday right before Halloween. We've been doing it for a number of years now to have the trunk or treat / fall block party. And our primary goal, of course, is to get information about the church into the hands of community members. And last night we had real close to 3,000 people come through. We were just shy of the number of 3,000, which is our average. Some of you were involved the year before COVID. I don't know if you remember that. The year before COVID, we had about 5,000 people come through the year before COVID. And then COVID hit, and we couldn't do the same thing the next year, so we did the drive-through service the next year, that Halloween, and we still had a little over 4,000 people come through. I think it was like 4,200 or something came through. Cars came through. And since then, we've done good to average right about 3,000 people, a little over, just a little under, but right at 3,000 people. And if you were here last night, one of the great things about the crowd that came through, it was more spread out over the course of the 3 hours, so it never felt like we were overwhelmed. In years past, we have sometimes been overwhelmed, especially in that first hour. We have 1,500 people, almost 2,000 people come through in the first hour, and the parking lot's crazy, and it's just overwhelming. And then we had it spread out over the course of 3 hours, so it was very steady, but there was never one point when you had 500 people backed up in line to come in. And we've had that before, so it was great. They all left with information about the church. On the back of that pamphlet we give out is a QR code that you can scan it with your phone, and it takes them straight to information on the website about the church, along with some information, and they have access to our videos and such online. So who knows? What we need to do now is pray that will have some teeth and sink in. That's what we need to pray for, that God will give the increase. But we did our part in sowing the seed, and everybody was a part of that in some way, and we appreciate everybody who participated in that. If you didn't get a chance to do it this year and you'd like to participate next year, there'll be plenty of opportunity for that if the Lord will. All right, 2 questions today off of lesson number 7. Here's the first question, and then we'll do a little bit of reading and then some answering on this. All right, so first question is this. Genesis chapter 7, verse 16 says that God shut the door. Why do you think that God shut the door and not Noah? And depending on your answer, what are the spiritual implications? So let me read the verse, and then I'll open it up for discussion. Verse 16, so those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded or had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. So by inspiration, there's an emphasis on the end of that verse about God shutting the door. So why do you think that took place? Why do you think God did that? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And he who shuts and no one opens, when the Lord shut that door,
Okay. So if you didn't hear Joel, he went to Revelation chapter 3, and there's two verses there. He quoted one, and those verses say, if the Lord opens the door, nobody can shut it. If He shuts it, nobody can open it. And so there was certainly a finality to the shutting of the door, that once the Lord had done that, it was never going to be undone. Any other reasons you might think of? That's a very good reason. Art, I saw your hand.
Well, I think, as Joel alluded to it, Noah might have had some friends, and he might have just said, well, come on, but he doesn't always know the heart of men, which God does.
Yeah.
And it's a very significant point.
Yeah, so along with that, to talk about, Gene, I saw your hand. So what about what Art said? Do you think that by doing that, God took the human factor out of the shutting of the door? Because there would probably be a big emotional component involved in shutting the door, and there may have been. I know that if I was in the same situation, there might have been on my end some emotional inability to shut the door. For example, if I saw, like Art was saying, and Joel kind of mentioned it, if I saw family members standing outside and God said, shut the door, there might have been, on my end, sort of an ill-timed mercy shown at the end to people who were standing on the outside. And so God took that off the table and He shut the door Himself. Gene, what were you going to say?
Well, there's probably a mechanical reason.
Okay.
It would have had to have been sealed.
Yes.
And to do that, you would have had to have been outside the ark. And so it would have left them with a predicament of how do you close and seal it.
Right. Okay, so that's certainly something I didn't think of, was the need to seal it from the outside. What about the size of the door itself? We're never given dimensions on the size of the door, but would you think maybe it was considerable in size? I would think it was. Now, obviously they embellish a lot when they constructed this, but there are a lot in this room, I know, who have been to the Ark Encounter up in Kentucky. And I've seen the photos. I'm talking with some of you who've been up there. We've been up a couple of times. It's worth seeing, right? Because dimensionally, right, the length, the height, the breadth of it, that's dimensionally right. There's 3 stories. And then inside, they've imagined what it could look like with all the nests and stuff inside the little rooms for the animals. There is a door in that exhibit, all right? I don't know if they're accurate in their portrayal of that door or not. I don't know. But I do know there's no way that a couple of men are going to be able to shut that door alone. It would require some type of machine to get that to be, because it's huge. It's a huge, huge door that's up there. If that's even close to the size of the door, it would have been humanly impossible on their own to have done that. Gene?
Well, it had to have been some kind of ramp like a drawbridge.
Yeah.
Because not only did it serve for the animals to get onto the ark, but after everything was destroyed, there had to be a way for them to get off of the ark.
Yeah.
And so the door had to have been large enough to fold out and touch the ground so that they could disembark.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know, but that makes a lot of sense to do that it serves sort of a dual purpose of sealing the ark. So there's the physical inability. What about this? Do you think perhaps in doing that, in the Lord shutting the door, that there were some long-range theological implications that He would later draw off of that for a lesson to us today? Look at Matthew chapter 25. Let's hold our place here and go to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. And by the way, if we were to go back up into Matthew chapter 24, at the very end of Matthew chapter 24, there are allusions to the flood of Noah. And if you'll look at it real carefully, just real quick, back in verse 36 of the previous chapter, chapter 24, it says, "Of that day and hour knows no one, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." And who gets mentioned in verse 37? All right, Noah does. "As in the days of Noah," and then it talks about the days before the flood. Verse 39, "They didn't know until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be." So there's already been an allusion to that. Look at chapter 25. Verse 1 beginning, "Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise, 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, 'Behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him.' Then all the virgins arose, they trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered and said, 'No, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those that sell and buy for yourselves.'" Now let's watch carefully verse 10. "While they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with them or him to the wedding, and the door was shut." Now, he doesn't use the name Noah, and there's no reference in here to the ark, but we can make some connection to what happened in the past. And I think this goes back to what Joel was talking about, the finality of the action, right? There's a finality to it. That when the Lord shuts it, it's not going to be open. And I don't know if in reading this ever you've thought, there's been a time in the past when God shut a door and it was never opened again until the Lord opened it. And the same thing is true here. And he's just talked about Noah back in chapter 24, verses 36 through about verse 39. So there's sort of maybe a theological connection we could make, at least in our minds, to say historically we've seen this physically happen. And now spiritually he's talking about a very similar thing. So there's some perhaps theological implication in that. And then I jotted down 2 more. And I don't know, I can't confirm that this happened. But I know that in desperate situations, do people who are placed into a desperate situation always act amicably, and they're very kind? If you're trying to escape rising floodwaters and you see that Noah and his family are in safety, where might you try to get? Inside the ark. I mean, you'd be beating on the outside of that. And my imagery was right before the COVID lockdowns, when they first said, "Hey, you may need to stock up on stuff." I don't know if any of you went to the grocery store to try to get anything during that time, but people were not kind in the grocery store. And they were grabbing things out of buggies, and it was, I thought, man, if we ever have a real crisis, we're in real trouble if this happens. But I can see that. I could see that happening. Assaults of the wicked would have been repelled by the fact that it was shut. God shut it. It wasn't going to be opened again. There's one more thing I jotted on mine. Which is, in doing that, in the Lord shutting that door, right? Because he raised the door, he shut the door or pulled it, however it was, there was miraculous confirmation of all the things that Noah had been preaching about all this time. So there was a miraculous confirmation that would have gone along with that. Like in Mark 16, 17 to 20, when he says, "The Lord went everywhere with them, confirming the word with signs following." So there would be a miraculous confirmation that all Noah had been talking about was true. Not only that, the rain itself would have done that. So for whatever reason, the Lord shut the door. Joel?
And we can't overlook the fact that the people had an opportunity
Ahead.
during the
Yeah.
time to construct that opportunity. They were just blindsided. They had an opportunity.
Yeah, had opportunity. Yeah, and they were warned not just a couple of days before it happened. They had plenty of time before it happened, but they did not listen. We don't know exactly the reason, but they're thinking through it. There could be potentially a number of overlapping reasons why the Lord shut the door. All right, so I want to spend the rest of our time here at number 2, and this is where we get back to Noah. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Who had their hand up? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Don't you think that right now the door to heaven is open?
It's open right now.
But in the day of judgment, God is going to close that.
It's going to close. Yeah.
People are going to be eating that door.
So to speak. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's the whole point in Matthew 25. The parable of the 10 virgins is a representation of when the Lord comes back, that there's going to be people prepared, and then there's going to be people unprepared, and the door is shut, which means there's no more chances after that. I think you're exactly right. So it's hard not to make the connection back and see the door being shut in Noah's day, because I think there's a physical demonstration of the very thing that's going to happen spiritually one day. There's separation between the lost and the saved when that happens. All right, I want to spend the rest of our time on number 2, because our study is about Noah. It's about the life of Noah, and I don't know that we often think about what's going on up here in Noah's mind, but we're going to try to do that, to put ourselves in his shoes and think about what was going on when this happened. So number 2, we don't often contemplate the effects of the flood on Noah, but what would have been the potential impact to him and to his family, chapter 7, verses 19 through 23. What things must have weighed heavily on their minds, and how do we handle all instances of worry and anxiety? Now, I want to do what we've done before. I want to look at the text, and then we want to go back and say, now, think deeply about this and the effect of this. So let's start in chapter 7, Genesis chapter 7, and let's start about a couple of things beginning about verse 12. And I promise that when we get to the beginning of chapter 8, I want to try to construct a timeline of all the water and figure out where the water's at, because chapter 8 and chapter 7 together basically give us a chronology of the rain beginning and how long the water was there, and when the water began to recede, and when it was receded enough for them to get off the ark. And we'll try to put all that together in the next series of questions. All right, so let's start verse 12. I've got just a few things. Verse 12. The rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Verse 13, very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Noah's wife, the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark, they and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah 2 by 2 of all flesh, which is in the breath of life. And then verse 16, which we read about the Lord shutting them in. Verse 17, the flood was on the earth 40 days. Water increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. So beginning in verse 12, we are told that the initial stage of the flood was characterized by a 40-day, 40-night period of rain, which according to verse 17, it was so massive, the rainfall and the amount of water coming out, like we talked about, from beneath the earth and over the atmosphere, that water vapor canopy, the massive amount of water lifted up the ark. And we have, I think, a reference to the same 40 days down in verse 17 and following. Then in verse 18, once it's up, the ark begins to move freely because the waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the earth moved about the surface of the water. So now you can just see it. The ark's been lifted up, and it's free-floating across the waters. It's not guiding itself anywhere. It's not being, its purpose was not to cut the water and to speed through the water, but just to float. And it's doing exactly its intended purpose here. And then in verses 19 and following, we get a little bit more description about the amount of water on the earth. So verse 19, waters greatly prevailed exceedingly on the earth. All the high hills under the heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits, that's close to 23 feet, 22 and a half feet upward. And the mountains were covered. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beast, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, every man. Then in verse 22 again, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So not aquatic animals, but everything on the earth. So water continues to rise with force. It kills every land-dwelling life outside the ark. Even the mountain ranges were covered by 15 cubits. And then, according to the end of this passage in verse 24, the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So there was a total of 150 days. I think that's the initial 40 plus 110 days for 150 days. And again, we'll put all this together when we finally get to chapter 8. So, there's obviously some massive changes are taking place as a result of this. We've talked about changed topography, but it's more than just geographical, topographical things taking place. What are some things that are happening outside the ark? And then we want to consider the emotional impact of that. What's going on? Okay, we talked about potentially the number of people that existed during that time. Okay, on the low side, people have estimated, this is without counting the long ages of the people in the pre-flood. They're just counting normal ages. They would have said potentially around a billion, in the high 750 million to a billion people. But if we take literally the ages of the people that lived back then, and we do that because there's no reason to doubt that, then we're talking really a world population around the time of the flood of about 4 to 5 billion people. Do you remember the emotional impact when just over 3,000 died on 9/11? Can you imagine the emotional impact of the knowledge that billions of people have died outside the ark? That's heavy to think about. And not just people. What else has died? The entire animal kingdom has died. Everything that's land dwelling has died outside of the ark. So, what societies existed, what cultures existed before the ark, it's all gone. Every bit of it. Zero societal relationships outside of the 8 people on the ark have survived that. It's every bit of it gone. Billions of dead bodies outside the ark. And then on top of that, the knowledge, the thought, with billions of people gone, whose responsibility is it to restart the world? It's theirs. It's Noah and his family. That is huge pressure to be under. It's just incredible to think about it. Now, there's been mass destruction, the knowledge of death, separations. Joe and I were talking, just before class. It is not as though Noah stepped on the ark and he goes, I got my whole family here, so I'm good to go. Okay, so he had his wife and he had his sons and he had the wives of the sons, right? There were 8 people on the ark. But do you think Noah had extended family outside the ark? Absolutely. Think he had friends outside the ark? And now you've got the door of the ark being shut and the rain is just torrentially falling to the point the ark's being lifted up and the whole world is covered in water, and you've got this recessed thought in the back of your mind, all my family's gone. All my friends are gone. All the culture's gone. All societies are gone. All the people are gone. All the animals are gone. That's weighty. That's hard for anybody to deal with. That's enough to give some people PTSD. It's enough for some people to have anxiety and worry. There's no question that those people on the ark were thinking about what was happening because they're human beings. We can put ourselves in their shoes. They weren't abnormal people. They're just like you and me, so we can understand the kind of pressure being put on them inside the ark. Turn to Proverbs chapter 12. Proverbs chapter 12. And then we're going to open it up. I want to talk about this because we're going to ask how could they have possibly dealt with this? Proverbs chapter 12. Look at verse 25. Anxiety in the heart of a man causes what? It has a very emotional, psychological impact. But a good word makes it glad. All right? So if you can take something like that and you can plug that into Noah, if there was any kind of anxiety, it's easy to see that there would have been serious emotional struggle, right? I'm not saying he was, don't take me to say he was crazy, because he wasn't. I'm just saying, as a human being, to put yourself in the shoes of Noah, that's a huge thing to think about, because he wasn't immune to the emotional effect of what was transpiring. Go to chapter 15, Proverbs chapter 15. Verse 13, a merry heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken, right? So if there's bad things happening, we tend to be affected by bad things happening. You know, when 9/11 happened, everybody can remember where they were for 9/11, and I don't know anybody here that was even close to that when it took place, because all of us were probably at school, in our homes, in the office, wherever, and we were hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. But I know people had to have counseling as a result of that, because they were so emotionally impacted by that. Can you imagine being in the ark and the Lord shuts the door and you know it's about to happen and the rain's falling and you know it. And whether or not somebody was beating on the outside of the ark, you still have the knowledge that billions of people are gone and all the animals that lived on land are gone. And you're living with that knowledge. That's tough to deal with that. So the question is, how do you cope with that? And on top of all of that, how long were they in the ark? Just a couple of days? In total, they're there for a little bit over a year. A year of isolation. You think people struggle with that? Being isolated like that? We were shut down and locked down for a couple of weeks, about a month, when we weren't together, and people were going crazy during COVID. So imagine a year of that. Art?
To me, it's similar also to when we realize that some of our loved ones are lost, died, and the lost will get.
It's terrible.
Well, can be depressing to us.
Yes.
Realizing, could I have done more? Could I have said more?
Yeah.
That type of thing. We have to kind of live with that
Yeah.
in our lives. Maybe like Noah had to live with seeing all these things that were gone.
And to your point, it wasn't just perishing physically, because they perished not just physically, spiritually they're gone, because there were only 8 righteous souls in the world, which means that when they died lost. That's just hard to imagine that. So let's talk about fear and anxiety, and let's talk about that, because surely it doesn't do anything to diminish our understanding of Noah to say they probably all had concerns about what was taking place. It's not a questioning of God, not by any means, but they were human beings, and it's impossible to imagine being in that position and not having some sort of concern about what was happening. Gene?
To me, this would be like being in a large-scale battle like we had in World War II. Because the ark didn't just overnight float and go away.
Right.
It rained for 40 days and the water eventually came up. In the meantime, people's houses were being washed away. They were clinging to debris. They would have been outside the ark. You could have heard the scream like you do in a battle.
It would have been terrible.
Comrades are dying. And it drives you up the wall.
Yeah. Well, just imagine as the water recedes, and unless there's something we don't know about what God did, where do those billions of bodies go once the water's receded? They're just scattered all over the earth. Can you imagine walking off the ark and there's just bodies that you're seeing everywhere? Just a constant reminder of what the Lord did. It is a huge emotional thing. All right. If anything, it does not diminish our understanding of Noah. He's still a hero. In fact, he's more of a hero because there's no question that in some way he dealt with the kind of stress that was placed upon him. He did it effectively. So how do we do that? And here's a couple of things I jotted down, and you're welcome to add to this list. So here's the first thing. Does God ever condemn people for having natural fear of bad circumstances? Nobody's ever condemned for natural fear of bad circumstances. It's never wrong to be scared of something that's happening. And we can prove that with the premier example. All right, so go to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. And then I want to come back to what Gene just said, because I think he's hit on something that maybe we don't think about, that Noah and his family surely experienced. So Hebrews chapter 5, let's go to verse 7. Speaking of Jesus, it says, who in the days of his flesh, that is, while he was upon the earth, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of godly fear. And then he talked about how, though he was a son, verse 8, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So this is talking about those moments leading up to his death. And in verse 7 it said, he was heard because of his godly fear, and he offered it up with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. Was Jesus physically scared in the Garden of Gethsemane? Yes, he was. He was sobbing because he was so scared. So let's imagine that we're on the ark and we're Noah, and we're so incredibly grateful that we've been delivered by what's going on. But you do hear, like Gene said, outside the ark, the beating of the waters on the ark and potentially screaming. And if anybody had a voice and they saw that there was a place of refuge, what do you think they were saying? Please let us in. That's hard to deal with. You'd been scared. I would have been scared. I don't care how tough you are. That's just emotionally impactful. Okay? The Bible never condemns, God never condemns having natural fear of something. And Jesus had that. So the flood and the sights and the sounds of the flood. Okay? But on top of that, there's always the potential when there's a scary situation to turn that fear against God. And Noah never did that. He never turned his fear against that. In fact, in the Bible we're told, he moved with godly fear in all of this. So how did he deal with that? How do we deal with that? So, yeah, Art, go ahead.
A couple things I think is in the 8th chapter, we know when Noah comes off the ark, just 2 verses later, what does he do?
Yep.
He builds
Sacrifices. That's right.
to God. He had the right attitude, and then what does God do right after that? He said, I'll make my covenant.
Yes.
Kills us what?
Yeah. That's right.
We can see today, which is still, to me, a positive thing God is doing to say, hey, look, I'm still with you, don't forget it.
Yes. I think that's, and obviously he was very, very grateful. And I think that helps us to understand that his gratitude was balanced against whatever natural fear he experienced, and the gratitude kept it from becoming something that was wrong. Let's do this. Yes. Go ahead.
But don't you think God, if He's going to wipe away all tears of the day of judgment, do you not think He has more to understand this?
Oh, yeah.
Because the people had over a year to listen to Him,
They had it.
and they refused to repent and turn away from their sin.
That is true. But we know from human experience that even though deep down we know that people had a chance to do something, it's still hard when they go. And I've taught people before and tried forever to teach people, and then they end up get cancer or pass away or something, and then you think, oh, it just hurts so much when they do it from an emotional human standpoint.
But don't you understand? Noah saved his wife
He did.
and family.
Yeah, and that's what Art was talking about. He's so grateful that they were able to be.
He tried to save his friends and
Sure.
his outward family,
Yes.
and they didn't listen.
Yeah. It's got to be tough. Got to be tough. Let's turn to Philippians chapter 4. There's a couple of points I want to make in Philippians chapter 4. I think we can apply these to Noah's. Gene, I saw your hand.
That's why people have PTSD.
Yes.
During the battle, your concentration is on survival.
Yes.
It's afterward
Mm-hmm.
that you think back on
Yeah.
what you went through, how close you came to dying. And the fact that you survived it doesn't help.
Right.
You can't get that out of you.
That's right. That's right. It's hard sometimes for people to understand, but when you have something so deeply emotional like that, and you infuse on top of that bad images or bad experiences, they never go away. They're just infused as a part of our framework as a result of that. So people do struggle with it. Let's look together at verse 6. Look at the beginning. Be anxious for nothing. Now, when the Bible uses the word anxious, right? Sometimes I'm anxious to come to the Lord's house on Sunday morning. I'm anxious to be with my brethren. I'm anxious for our summer series. I'm anxious for Vacation Bible School. Is that the kind of anxiousness that's being spoken of here? What does this mean? What is anxiousness here? Worry, okay. Inordinate worry, right? It's a worry to the point that I'm actually calling in question the ability of God to do His part, to finish His end of whatever the circumstance is. And so this is a kind of incapacitating fear that's being spoken of. And fear is an imperfect bond to God. We cannot bond with God over paralyzing fear. It's love that binds us to God. So God says, do away with anxiety. You can't have this. Don't be anxious in anything. Then He tells us how to avoid that. Verse 6, in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now, somebody was just talking about, they were in the ark the entire time. Do you think in the somewhat year that they were in the ark, that God just left them there in silence for the whole year? You think there was some regular communication that was taking place and they were walking with God still while they were on the ark?
I think sometimes they would overlook that. God had a role in this whole thing.
Every bit of it.
Knowing them, they didn't go out and round up all the animals,
Yes.
They're probably good at that.
Right?
Who took care of those animals? Who says that those animals God didn't put them in the ark? Who knows?
Right?
God had a hand in everything.
That's right. And then, like Art was just talking about, do you think you see the physical demonstration of this after he gets off of the ark? Do you think that every day that Noah was on the ark and looked at his wife and saw his children and their wives, that he was grateful to have survived what took place on the outside? So there's overwhelming gratitude, and you see it right here in verse 6 when he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. It's thanksgiving that counterbalances and supersedes that anxiousness at the beginning of the verse, let your request be made known to God. And then, of course, verse 7, the result of that is the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. So there's a way to have a strong mind. Now, all of that's based on what we know about the nature of God. So when bad circumstances come, and nothing more catastrophic than the flood, there's never been anything like that, to trust and rely on the goodness of God, that He's all-powerful, so I know He can do it, and He's all-knowing, so I know He knows what to do, and there's a knowledge, a peace that comes out of that helps us to navigate through any circumstance. But the next time we're reading chapter 8 or chapter 7, and we're talking about the massive destruction outside of the ark, don't think for a second that Noah and his family were unaffected by that, because they were people just like us. It was emotionally toiling on them to experience that. And yet, we never read where Noah was distrustful of God. He wasn't. Or that he fell into inordinate fear, because he never did. So he handled it by turning it over to God and being thankful. And we have to do the same thing. Any concluding thoughts? Yeah, Tommy?
Well, what kind of Noah preached? And I'm sure that as we do, we preach with emotion.
Yeah.
Trying to get people to do what is right. And after all those years, just he and his family were saying that had to have some kind of effect on them there, knowing what happened.
Yeah.
They wouldn't listen to it.
Yeah, I just say from a personal perspective, and as a preacher, and others can do that, and elders do the same thing, or Bible class teachers who are invested in your students. I can stand up and I can preach a sermon, and you don't get to turn that off when you're done, right? Sometimes you can design a sermon because you're aiming at one person, because you want so much somebody to obey the gospel, and then that sermon ends, the invitation ends. You live with that, because there have been plenty of times when I can be driving home after a sermon where I thought I could get somebody with a sermon, and I'm just crying, because I think, what more could I say? What more could we do to try to help somebody? And can you imagine preaching for maybe upward of 100 years and begging people, just if you'll just repent, there's destruction coming, and then it finally comes, and you realize they're lost. I mean, that's heavy. That's just hard to deal with that. So Noah was a man, and he had a lot on him, and we can't forget that when we read that. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. Put a peg in it here. We'll come back. We'll look at the next 2 questions next week. Thank you, guys.